Welcome, everyone. So excited to have you all here for our Lunch and Learn. This is the first of a three-part series about navigating the social determinants of mental health. And today we will be looking at unpacking these, and so excited to have Alec Stratford, who is our Executive Director and Registrar, and who's going to be sharing some of his great wisdom. Want to first invite everyone to join with me in a land acknowledgement. If you are not familiar with where you are located and the Indigenous name, please go to placenames.mapdev.ca. You can find the link on the bottom right of your screen, or you can go to Google. And please join in the chat, acknowledging specifically where you are located. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking from Unama'ki, which is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, whose inherent rights were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties that were signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. This series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. The treaties were later reaffirmed by Canada in Section 35 of the Constitution Act in 1982, and they remain active to this day. Let us take this time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. The Nova Scotia College of Social Workers commits to translating this acknowledgement into action. By seeking to implement the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, especially those regarding education, we commit to doing what we can to becoming better treaty partners. We commit to learning and to unlearning. Let us take this moment to pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, and this community that we share, by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. Let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. May our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. Ulalu. With that, I am going to stop my screen share and hand it over to Alec that he may teach us.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I hope that folks found some rest over the summer and are gearing up for what is, I'm sure, already looking like an incredibly busy fall. Again, being able to reflect and rest and find ourselves, of course, is resistance in and of itself. And hopefully we're able to come together today and start to formalize what our approach is to addressing the social determinants of mental health. What I intend to do, and this is, as Hanaj mentioned, this is a three-part learning, lunch and learn. Today, preliminarily going over the impacts of the social determinants of health and what sustains them. There will be two other, what maintains the status quo, why we haven't really seen action there. we have 2 other sessions planned that will talk more about the policy that is needed and how we start to mobilize around that. So today is very much an introduction to this topic and a deeper dive as well into some of its implications and where we're going. And there will be, hopefully, if I planned correctly, we will have some opportunity for discussion at the end of this session as we dive into this content. So again, the social determinants of mental health are conditions in the environments where people are born, live, learn, work, and play, and age that affect a wide range of health and quality of life outcomes and risk. These determinants can significantly influence mental health outcomes as well as disparities. So again, there's a prevailing view in our society that mental health conditions often appear out of the blue, largely affecting those who are genetically predisposed, and that these conditions are lifelong, uncontrollable, and that the only solution seems to be finding the right medication and, of course, medicalized talk therapy. However, this viewpoint is increasingly being challenged as there's a large body of research which paints a much larger picture of what impacts our overall mental well-being and health. Now, firstly, we now understand with a high degree of certainty that diagnoses like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia are not distinct conditions. It's common to see clients displaying a mix of symptoms from disorders across the spectrum. Moreover, many people manage to lead productive lives despite experiencing severe psychiatric symptoms at times, often without seeking help. For example, there's a global network for individuals who may identify or be hearing voices. Many of those cope perfectly well without psychiatric intervention. Outcomes for severe mental illness are much more varied than previously thought. Surprising numbers of individuals make a full or partial recoveries, sometimes even without medication. However, the definition of recovery varies. While professionals often focus on symptom relief, patients emphasize self-esteem, hope, and a valued societal role. While genetics do play a role, it's a complex one. Hundreds, if not thousands, of genes are involved, each increasing risk slightly. A genetic researcher, Kenneth Kindler, puts it like this: the genetic risk for something like schizophrenia is widely distributed among the human population, so we all carry some degree of risk. However, the multitude of genes involved suggests that breakthroughs from genetic research alone are unlikely to be in the future. For instance, despite knowing the single dominant gene causing Huntington's disease, there's still no medical therapy for it. Recent studies highlight numerous social and environmental factors, in fact, that increase mental health risk. And that is predominantly where we see the social determinants of mental health. In that, when we include things like childhood poverty, social inequality, early urban exposure, migration, ethnic minority status, early parental separation, childhood abuse, school bullying, all of these expose folks to adversities, which can increase the risk of psychosis threefold, with multiple traumatic experiences leading to even higher risk levels. What we know is that the context in which we live, the socioeconomic and political influencers have much more of an impact than any kind of genetic or biological dysfunction within the brain or within our bodies. These experiences also impact brain structure, explaining why, again, abnormal neuroimaging findings in neuroimaging findings in psychiatric patients. Adult adversities such as debt, unhappy marriages, experience of racism, disability, discrimination, unemployment threat also contribute to mental health greatly. So why does this all matter? Well, many mental health clients feel that their life stories are often ignored by services. They are frequently offered powerful drugs, talk therapy, but rarely do we discuss the socioeconomic and political conditions impacting wellness. A narrow medical approach has been largely unsuccessful. Recovery rates for severe mental illness have not improved since World War II, unlike survival rates for severe physical conditions like cancer or heart disease. Furthermore, an exclusive biological approach tends to increase mental illness stigma. People are more likely to shun psychiatric patients when mental illness is viewed as genetically determined by the brain rather than a reaction to unfortunate circumstances. This approach also neglects the public health dimensions. Given the evidence that we have and is clear in front of us, we should be able to significantly reduce mental health issues by addressing things like childhood poverty, inequality, determining harmful aspects of our urban environments, and ensuring, again, that childhood experiences are positive. Some potential influences on mental health, such as our school systems, have hardly been studied. We cannot create a healthier world if we spend all our time peering into test tubes and not spending time looking at the political context to which we exist and work within. One of the helpful, or what I believe helpful tools to help us analyze, again, the social determinants of mental health is, again, the theory of intersectionality, which is, again, coming out of critical theory and social justice, and examines how various social identities, such as race, class, gender, sexual orientation, religion, disability, and other axes of identity interact on multiple levels and contribute to systemic injustices and social inequality. Intersectionality provides a framework for understanding how aspects of one's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. Intersectionality, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, it is a theoretical framework that acknowledges that each individual experience is shaped by interplay of these different categories, and recognizes these categories do not exist independently, but interact on multiple and often simultaneous levels, contributing to social injustice and social inequality. Now, how does this tie to mental health? Well, the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. When it comes to mental health, we often focus on those biological or individual psychological factors, neglecting the broader role of the social environment. The social determinants of mental health, again, are conditions that are political, are economic, are social, and that impact our health system and how that is structured and organized as well. Again, it is shaped by the distribution of money, and most notably power and resources at a global, national, and local level. In the context of mental health, the social determinants can include, again, socioeconomic status, education, neighborhood and physical environment, employment, social support network, and overall access to healthcare. We apply the lens of intersectionality to these social determinants, we see a complex, intertwined web of influences on mental health. For example, a low-income racial minority woman may face discrimination and bias based on her race and gender and socioeconomic status. This intersection of identity exposes her to higher levels of stress, potential trauma, and limited access to quality mental health services, all which significantly impact overall mental well-being. We also see intersectionality at play with the LGBTQ2SIA community, where individuals frequently face hate, stigma, discrimination, and violence due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. These negative experiences lead, statistically, we've seen it, to higher rates of mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. By acknowledging the role of intersectionality, we can better understand the social determinants of mental health and work towards a more equitable society. We can develop policies and interventions that address these overlapping social identities and their impact on mental health. We can create safe, inclusive environments and provide accessible, culturally relevant mental health services. Intersectionality and the social determinants of health are inextricably linked. By acknowledging and addressing these conditions, we can move to a different type of system. So identifying the social determinants of mental health, which I've done a number of times already, but what does this look like in practice? Again, the World Health Organization defines the social determinants of health as conditions in which people are socioeconomic status in which people are impacted by, again, those conditions in which we live. Socioeconomic status, again, a significant determinant of mental health, is an undeniable fact. Again, we see the impacts that poverty has on a regular basis on our overall mental health and well-being. Again, when we look at the literature, particularly on adverse childhood experiences, which again, where we see particularly childhood poverty, we've noted and can show the data that experiencing a significant number of adverse childhood experiences is statistically relevant to forming a mental health disorder, complex mental health disorder, as smoking is to cancer. Yet, in terms of our reaction or interventions, we've done nothing, particularly in this province, to address things like child poverty. In fact, we have the worst record of every province in Canada in addressing, again, key contributors there. Again, poverty can lead to increased stress, less access to quality healthcare, higher exposure to adverse events, as well as can contribute to overall mental health challenges. Therefore, again, assessing an individual's socioeconomic situation, looking at things like education, which is a significant social determinant, looking at things like physical environment, including housing, and neighborhood conditions also play a crucial role in understanding how the social determinants of mental health are impacting a client's current conditions and context. Again, all of these things are political. When we talk about housing, which we are right now, there have been political choices that have been made to create, again, an environment in which there is a tenant class, which is, again, subservient and exploited for landlords to be able to extract wealth from. When we look at things like education, we can, again, post-secondary education in this province is the most expensive in any province in Canada. And that continues to create barriers for folks, which impacts broader health. Social support networks are equally important. Being socially isolated and not being connected to community has a significant impact. Again, when we look at when we look at things like our wages, for instance, the living wage report was produced today by CCPA, which now shows that the living wage in the HRM is $26 an hour. When people aren't earning a living wage, as CCPA points out, it impacts their ability to be involved in community. Think about the things that cost money to go to, whether it be arts, whether it be a concert, even a sporting event, even being able to put your kids in things like swimming. All of this is impacted, again, by political choices that we have made, which contribute to our overall mental health. And of course, access to healthcare services is also a key determinant. Again, without access to adequate mental health services, individuals cannot get the help they need. And particularly if those services are not relevant to their needs and are not timely. We know that mental health in and of itself is progressive. That again, if we can find meaningful interventions earlier, it prevents, again, further harm in that regards. So assessing the social determinants of mental health requires a holistic approach that takes into account not just the individual symptoms, which is what our current model is really based on and rooted in, but also the broader social, economic, and political context and how it's impacting an individual's overall mental well-being. By doing so, we can ensure, again, more accurate assessments and more effective interventions, and ultimately, a better mental health outcomes. So let's look again more closely at the impact of, not being able to factor in the broader social determinants of mental health on our overall health of our population and the ways that it prevents itself. Certainly, we know that racism is a core factor that influences mental health. Recent studies have shown a concerning disparity in mental health outcomes among racialized communities when compared to white communities. Specifically, racialized communities were found to be more likely to report poor mental health at 27.8% compared to 22.9% in white communities. Even more alarming, these communities also reported higher instances of symptoms consistent with moderate and severe mental health. Racism, both systemic and interpersonal, significantly impact mental health, causing considerable psychological distress. The psychological burden of constant discrimination and bias can lead to conditions such as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress, which disproportionately affect racialized individuals. Racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress is a cumulative result of racial bias, discrimination, and hate crimes within our society. It's not just about isolated instances, but the constant ongoing exposure to such events can lead to severe emotional distress and mental health issues. Systemic racism perpetuates inequities in resource access and opportunities, affecting mental health access. In Canada, for example, racial discrimination influences the accessibility and effectiveness of mental health systems, contributing to disparities within racialized and Indigenous communities. This results in these communities being underserved by mental health services, leading to lower rates of assessment and overall support. Studies have shown that discrimination based on race significantly impacts the mental health of Black and African African Canadian individuals. These discrimination can take many forms, from explicit bias to microaggressions to systemic discrimination in healthcare, education, and employment. The resulting stress can lead to higher levels of mental health disorders and ultimately impacts overall well-being. Again, a crucial factor of how we align mental health services is factoring in the impact of race and racism into how we support and how we both plan and decide what our political choices are. Again, the impact of disability on mental health and how it is viewed, and again, how it impacts mental health is fairly profound as well. In Canada, we are witnessing an alarming trend. As of 2021, 8.7 of employed individuals have a mental health related disability, a significant increase of 6.4% in 2019. Our economic system is making us sick and is causing us to become sicker. This stark rise is not just a statistic. It represents our fellow Canadians, our families, friends, and colleagues who are grappling with these challenges every day. Over 2 million Canadians aged 15 and older have a mental health related disability. The prevalence is slightly higher in Ontario. These numbers underscore the urgent need to address the growing concern in our country. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated these conditions, causing a decline in mental health and coping abilities. The fear, uncertainty, and isolation brought about by the pandemic have taken a significant toll on the overall mental well-being of our citizens, including exacerbation of mental health-related disabilities. Moreover, there's a strong connection between mental health and other disabilities. Multiple disabilities are associated with depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and poor self-rated mental health. The correlation means that those living with disabilities often experience a higher rate of developing a mental health issue due to the increased stress, isolation, and stigma they face. The intersection between mental health and disability highlight the importance of viewing mental health through a broader lens. We must understand that the mental health crisis in our country is not just a health issue, but a social and political one. Again, we can look at the impacts of sexism in our society and the overall patriarchy and what its and its impacts. We can look at women specifically. Gender plays a key role in the diagnosis of depression, with women reporting higher levels of depression than men. This is not simply because women are biologically more susceptible to depression, but is largely due to the societal pressures placed on women, being again expected to not only be in the workforce, but providing care at home and still doing the dominant amount of emotional labor and labor in the house while being expected to work, as well as pressure put on, as well as pressure from, of course, gender-based violence and perpetuated by patriarchal norms. As we've learned from the Mass Casualty Commission, and I shouldn't say we learned because we knew before, but what the Mass Casualty Commission highlighted is that gender-based violence is an epidemic in our country, and has a horrific manifestation out of both sexism and patriarchy, and of course has severe mental health consequences. 64% of women experience abuse exhibit symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. This traumatic experiences can leave lasting psychological scars, leading to debilitating conditions such as depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. Again, men have been impacted by sexism and patriarchy as well. For men, the impacts of patriarchy on mental health manifest differently, but are equally damaging. Patriarchy often disconnects men from emotions, framing seeking support as weakness. This harmful stereotype can prevent men from seeking help when they need it, exacerbating feelings of anxiety and depression. The pressure for men to always appear strong and self-reliant can lead to a cultural silence around mental health, leaving men to suffer in silence. The COVID-19 pandemic has further highlighted gender differences in mental health, with women reporting higher levels of anxiety and substance use, and it's evident that the pandemic has disproportionately affected women. This doesn't just play out in mental health statistic, it plays out in employment statistics, physical health statistics, workforce statistics, many, that women bore the brunt of the pandemic and continue to lag behind in much of our recovery. These disparities can be attributed to increasing burden, of course, of caregiving, job loss, the rise of domestic violence during lockdowns. Ultimately, the intersection of sexism, patriarchy, and mental health is a complex one, but ultimately clear that it's having a huge impact. It requires us to challenge deeply ingrained societal norms and biases, but it's a fight that we need to continue to have. Research has consistently shown over and over again the impact that our current society has on the LGBTQ2SIA individuals, who are more likely to experience depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and substance use than their peers. This disproportionate impact of mental health issues is not a consequence of being a member of the LGBTQ2SIA community, but rather a result of societal prejudice, discrimination, hate, and a lack of understanding overall. We've seen again in the last number of weeks, growing hate, not even weeks, over the last decade, growing hate towards this community, and again, being used as political scapegoats to address, failed policy in other areas. All of this, again, points to the need for us to better support, create safer environments, and ultimately ensure that voices are included when making policy. Our sexual minority youth are particularly vulnerable. Canadian data show that they are more likely to experience negative health outcomes than their peers. Young people are at a critical stage in their lives, shaping their identities and futures, and the additional burden of mental health challenges can have lifelong impacts. These findings echo data from around the world, underscoring the global nature of this issue. Research supports emerging trends in the relationship between sexual orientation and gender identity and depression, and it's evident that belonging, belonging and social inclusion are incredibly important to our overall mental health. So, again, highlighted high level there, again, some of the impacts of the social determinants of mental health, how we've aligned, again, discrimination, hate, and prejudice against individuals, as well as, again, how our economic and political systems are aligned to entrench both patriarchy, inequality, and has had a profound impact on our overall mental health. The question is, again, why? Given the amount of evidence around the social determinants of mental health and how it would greatly impact our overall well-being, our overall quality of life, and our overall society. Why have we not moved forward with more robust policies to address them? Well, the understanding of this is really comes back to your class analysis. Is that we've made political choices that have entrenched a class system. In every era, the ruling class ideas permeate society, shaping our collective understanding and beliefs. Again, going back to Marx's fundamental work, when we consider public perceptions of emotional suffering and behavioral disturbances, which pose a political threat to the current status quo, that is, if we are to actually support folks, make political decisions that would include them greater in our society, if we were to actually, to start to dismantle patriarchy and sexism, well, this undermines our entire capitalist and neoliberal system. It starts to, again, create greater equality, and it starts to, remove the power that our current ruling class has, and starts to restore or starts to strengthen our democracy and our overall ability to influence these policies. So there's a significant reason why we haven't moved forward with embracing many of the policies that would substantially affect, again, our overall well-being. Again, we can look at it this way. 2 decades ago, criticisms of psychiatry, its limited success in treatment outcomes, some of the debunked serotonin balance theory and the questionable validity of the DSM diagnostic manuals were seen as radical ideas. Today, certainly these criticisms are accepted within psychiatric circles and reported more by mainstream media. However, some critiques remain largely unspoken. Questions about whether viewing emotional suffering and behavioral disturbances as medical disorders have been beneficial or detrimental remain largely unexplored. These discussions pose a threat when we have them to establish order, including the established order, including, of course, psychiatry, big pharma, and the media industry in and of itself, and is heavily reliant, of course, on capitalism in order to function itself. Often, again, I do media on issues of poverty, particularly around issues of social assistance. And I often have journalists ask me, particularly when we're in a cost of living crisis, why do you think government is not moving forward with increasing things like income assistance? And my answer is always the same, which is that poverty is required for capitalism to thrive. What that means is that in order to have cheap labor, which is at the juxt of capitalism, it needs cheap labor in order to exploit and extract large processes. You need poverty to incentivize, to find an incentive for folks to work. Otherwise, there is no incentive for work, particularly cheap work. So rarely do journalists, when I state that, publish that comment or publish that truth, because it is not something we speak about. It's not something that we are able to unpack. We have been void of a class analysis in our system and in our understanding of these issues, and have continued to sustain, again, the neoliberal paradigm, capitalist paradigm, in many of our interactions and actions. Now, again, research has shown that labeling someone with a medical illness increases belief in biological causality, intensifies the perceived seriousness of the condition, and incites fear, leading to greater social distance. Fear is also needed to sustain our current system. As we start to see more and more impacts of our current cost of living crisis, which is rooted in all of this, the dire economic situation that folks find themselves in, as well as, again, the impacts on the current labor market and the overall ruling and employing class, we're starting to see the ruling class be much more deliberate in what their intent is, with billionaires saying we welcome a recession because that would solve our issue with people wanting to continue to work from home. Again, keeping fear, keeping oppression, keeping people in that a constant place of social isolation, again, sustains our overall system and leads, again, to many of these mental health issues that we're facing. Despite extensive research, to this point in time, no neurobiological accounts or credible imaging-based biomarkers for any psychiatric disorder have been found. Similarly, no genetic variances have been identified that predict schizophrenia or mood disorders. Again, there's indicators, but they haven't been substantially proven at this point in time. Intricately, research suggests that placebos often yield better results. Hero and Job's findings on psychiatric treatment outcomes remain largely overlooked by journalists until Robert Whitaker brought them to the public attention in 2010. Again, we continue to see randomized control studies that show that a lot of times these psychiatric drugs don't really impact recovery at all. So again, criticizing the medical model is considered taboo because it poses a financial and political threat to the ruling class. However, numerous links have been observed between psychiatric conditions and socioeconomic variables. The Adverse Childhood Experience Study have demonstrated a powerful connection between childhood trauma, subsequent adult and emotional and mental health issues. Yet the ruling class narrative continues to propagate the idea that psychological suffering is caused by individual medical defects rather than alienating and traumatizing society. So again, discrimination is a form of class control. Class power, the ability of one social class to control another, is deeply entrenched in our society. It's established and sustained through various mechanisms, including economic, politics, and education. However, one area where its influence is particularly pronounced, yet often unacknowledged, is in the provision of mental health care. As discussed, access to quality mental health care is heavily influenced by socioeconomic status. Those with wealth and privilege have better access to resource treatments and supports. They can often afford private therapy or expensive medications, and they typically have jobs that offer health insurance or allow time off for recovery. And often, again, what we see is the moving of wealth from the working class to the ruling class in terms of the provision of our mental health. Provision of big pharma, again, all of these very expensive medicalized talk therapy provisions, all again are big money makers that sustain, again, this class divide. In contrast, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds often face significant barriers to accessing the care they need. This disparity is not an accident by any means or incidental. It is a deliberate, constructed, designed to sustain class power. By limiting access to mental health care for the underprivileged, the system perpetuates a cycle of poverty and illness that keeps the lower classes disadvantaged and disempowered, and thus exploitable for both their labor and as well as consumers. Discrimination and othering are core tools used to establish and maintain this class power. By stigmatizing mental illness and offering those who struggle with it, and often those who struggle with it, again, that class divide is maintained. Society effectively marginalizes these individuals, making it easier to deny them the resources and support they need. This offering also serves to reinforce the false narrative that mental illness is a personal failing rather than a societal issue that requires collective responsibility and action. Moreover, the discourse around mental health is often dominated by the voices of the privileged, further entrenching class power. The narratives and experience of those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are frequently overlooked or dismissed, reinforcing the idea that their struggles are less valid or less important. We must acknowledge the role of class power in shaping our approach to mental health and actively work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate this inequality. We must strive for a society where mental health care is seen as a fundamental human right, not a privileged reserved for the wealthy. We must ensure that everyone, regardless of their socioeconomic status, has access to the care and support that they need. Again, this isn't by accident, and this isn't, again, something that we've just come upon. We have made deliberate policy choices to allow us to sustain this current status quo. Again, many of those policy choices are rooted in the current and dominance of neoliberalism. Which again significantly impact our overall quality of life. Now, neoliberalism, with its emphasis on free market economics, deregulation, and individual responsibility, has been a dominant force shaping our world for the past several decades. And neoliberalism and the medical model are very much aligned and worked hand in hand. However, research, again, from the University of Montreal suggests that there are significant consequences to this ideological approach far beyond just our economy. The research shows that neoliberalism can adversely affect human health and social ties. It's also linked to poor collective health and well-being due to its fundamental principles. It promotes competition over cooperation, privatization over public ownership, and profit over people's needs. The focus on the free market rather than the right to health has led to deep changes in healthcare systems that have not always been beneficial for the public. The neoliberal reforms have resulted in healthcare becoming more of a commodity to be bought and sold rather than a basic right. This shift has disproportionately affected those in lower economic brackets who cannot afford high quality private care or do not have the same political power to be able to influence policy or where it might be going. Furthermore, more neoliberal policies have led to greater income inequality over the past 25 years, even in Nova Scotia, where the rich continue to get richer while the poor struggle to make ends meet. The increased financial stress can lead to a sense, again, of low personal control over one's circumstances, which in turn continues to lead to poor mental health outcomes. Increased poverty and unemployment, often side effects of neoliberal economic policies, are further compounding health inequalities. With less income, people are less likely to afford necessities, as we've been seeing, as we address the cost of living crisis that we're currently in. This lack of access to essential resources leads to worse health outcomes. We've chosen this system, and we continue to see solutions to the political problems that continue to draw on this ideology and these this worldview to create or to solve the problems that it has created. Again, we know that housing is a significant social determinant of health. We know that we are currently in a housing crisis. This has been building for a long period of time. The reason that we are in a housing crisis is because we have allowed the free market full control over our housing. And we have negated our responsibility to provide public, not-for-profit housing and to determine and to see housing as a right rather than a commodity. Yet, we see both our premier and the leader of the Conservative Party nationally promote more neoliberal thinking as the solution to our current housing crisis. That is, again, if we simply build more housing, that will bring affordability issues down. It negates the fact that, again, the free market's goal is not to provide affordable housing, it is to generate profit for individuals. It negates the need, again, that housing is continually being financialized by individuals, transferring wealth from the working class and the poor to the wealthy. It has created a class system between homeowners and renters, all of which are addressed politically and not by recreating the systems. Within mental health and our delivery of healthcare, we are continually seeing, particularly our provincial government here, push for the privatization of healthcare, whether it be hiring TELUS to provide one individual session and paying TELUS to which they profit off of, to opening up MSI billing for private practitioners. These are recreations of our current neoliberal system and are doubling down on the very same ideology that has created these challenges and these problems. The reality is that we can make different policy choices and we can mobilize to affect broader change. Now, that's what the next two series that we're going to talk about are going to lead us to, which is looking at what the alternative would be. You know, rather than expanding or opening up MSI billing to increase access, what would it look like? In terms of how we would develop housing, how would we impact poverty, how would we impact adverse childhood experiences? What are the policy decisions that we can make? And we have them. We know what they are, and we know we can afford them. Oftentimes, we hear the narrative of why the system is that we simply can't afford it. The reality is that we cannot afford it because we have created a system that have allowed a few people to amass an incredible amount of wealth off the backs of working and poor folks. And we have not meaningfully distributed that through social policy programs, income supports, or minimum wage provisions. We'll then look at how we can start to mobilize for action. This is again, political. It requires a political response. We'll look at the tools in our third series on how we might be able to mobilize. I'm going to end there. I'm not sure what my time's looking like, but I think we probably have a good time for questions.
And yes, we do. We have also some awesome questions that have been coming up and some great discussion. So one of the questions is around living wages and rent. So you had talked a little bit about that at the very beginning, and Deborah actually has added a little bit more on that. So she did some calculations and calculated $4,472 a month gross, assuming 30%, which is the generally accepted percentage one should pay for housing. That would make it $1,350 for housing, which is really not anything that anyone has seen in a really long time, and how people are paying between 50 to 70% for rent, which doesn't leave anything for anything else. So there's been a lot of debate or discussion around that, which our social justice committee is looking at because it's so dire. So maybe if you want to share a little bit about that. There was another question as well that we can go to next.
Yeah, I mean,
the role of rent and living wage in the social determinants of health.
Yeah, so let's talk about minimum wage to begin with. When minimum wage was first brought into law, it was not based on anything. There was no analysis done on what is a livable or minimum wage. We set it at $1. There was a period of time in the up until around the 1970s when a minimum wage was a livable wage. Where again, you could afford a house, a vacation, lots of things by making a living wage. That was when we had an expansive and generous social safety net in Canada, which we have predominantly done away with. We can look back to the last time, and of course, one of the other things I should have discussed but did not discuss during this presentation, and I'll make a note to add it, is of course the impact of climate change and the need for climate justice as well. But when we look at the last time our economy transitioned in a major way, was when we were coming out of World War II. Ultimately, we had created a wartime economy, and we had, of course, lots of soldiers coming back from overseas, as well as women who were in the workforce transitioning back out of the workforce, and an expansive baby boom, all of which required a complete updating and overhaul of our social welfare system. What we chose to do at that point in time was recognize that the burden of that transition should not be felt by the most vulnerable to that burden. And so we put in, this came out of the Marsh report, which social workers significantly contributed to. And what we built was an expansive social safety net, including income insurance, old age pensions, housing on top of that, and funding, significant funding to post-secondary education. We socialized a lot of the costs that we're seeing today. We took the costs off the kitchen table and started to spread those out across our society. So a number of things happened when neoliberalism started to take hold in the early 80s. One, we were given the false narrative that our social safety net was not sustainable. It was not sustainable to the ruling class. It was very sustainable to the rest of us. And so we started to dismantle that social safety net, particularly the provision of public and social housing. You can look even in our city, the West End, which has many of those post-World War II homes, the floor and kind of the 2 bedrooms up above. A lot of those were built again by government and led by the Canadian federal government. The last time we significantly invested in social and public housing in Nova Scotia was in the early 90s. It was Brian Mulrooney's one of the last budgets was the tailing out of big national spendings. We used to build, I believe the number was around 300,000 public housing units a year in Canada. We stopped doing that and we let the free market take over. All of this to say is that what we have done is financialized the market, Nova Scotia being particularly vulnerable to REITs, real estate and investment trust funds, in which people are parking their money into real estate for the purposes of making profit. And of course, again, it's very profitable to be a slum landlord in particular. We have very few regulations to hold landlords accountable. And all of this has led to the price and the cost. But to your point, the desperation that this has created, again, many of us who have good incomes or salaries are struggling with the current cost of living. And again, we have to look at, and I think the data has probably changed now that the living wage is as high as it is. But last year's living wage report calculated that 50% of Nova Scotians were earning less than a living wage. That is unsustainable to our mental health, to our well-being, and to our overall society. So just my comments on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot that needs to be addressed. And mental note, please check. We are going to be having next week a whole conversation on affordable housing and continuing to discuss that. There was also a question about the role of the family in social determinants of mental health.
Yeah, that has to do, again, with social isolation and social exclusion. And we also have to look at what we mean by the role of family, right? Oftentimes when we talk about the role of family, what we're talking about is the role of women to care for us. This is also part of the privatization of our services, is that instead of taking a collective approach, we've downloaded a lot of the responsibilities of care and caring onto women in our society. Again, even though numbers are changing in terms of, men and fathers being involved in child caring, the dominant amount of labor work, emotional labor, is still being done by women in the family. So, of course, family plays a crucial role in understanding our connection to family, its interactions, how we thrive through it, our central pillars. We also have to be conscious of, how we positioned family in the role of care in our society as well, because it has disproportionately impacted women when we do that.
Absolutely. And so there's a lot of conversation that's going on in the chat around the $26 an hour that you had mentioned as a living wage. And does that, like, how does that, the number, while impressive, still doesn't feel accurate because of the rent costs. And there's just a lot of more conversation around the housing in particular.
So the new report just came out today. So I have not been through it with a time-tooth comb, but I serve with Christine at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and I can tell you the methodology is pretty robust at this point in time in terms of how that calculation is done, and pretty accurate. Now, again, what we're talking about here is not, a living wage is not like big living, luxurious life. It factors in the bare minimum to live a quality life, including being involved in community, being involved in social activity and events. Again, housing has had a huge impact on that living wage. Last year, the living wage was around $22. So the fact that it's jumped by $4 an hour in the period of years shows, again, the significant impact that housing is having on. We have to remember right now, too, that the housing crisis is not impacting all Canadians. This is part of the class divide that we continue to see, is that when you look at demographics in Canada, a third of Canadians would own their home, a third would have mortgages, and a third are renting. The current housing crisis is impacting those that are renting the most at this point in time. But those third that have mortgages, those who have variable rates are obviously feeling the impacts of interest rates rising. But it's when a lot of those fixed term rates come up for renewal in 2024 and 2025 that the biggest impact is going to be felt in terms of these cost of living increases across the board. But this is the real challenge when we're looking at renting right now. Is that we have created a society and a class system that, again, generally discriminates or oppresses against those who are renting and privileges those who are looking towards home ownership or own homes. One of the biggest reasons why we haven't seen, I think, discourse on the type of policy that would actually impact housing affordability is because many Canadians' livelihood, their retirement, their pensions are caught up in the value of their housing. The reality is that the value of housing is really good for some people, or they think it's really good because that is their plan for retirement. That is their plan for. So if we were to input a bunch of policies that radically brought down their cost of what their market rate of their house was, well, that impacts a heck of a lot of people with a heck of a lot of power. And so this is the complexity of the political conversation that we're having right now, is that, again, in order to really affect affordability, we are fundamentally changing that class system, which of course is what we need to do, but the choices we need to make are increasingly hard politically to sell, because those with power benefit from the current system.
Thank you. It looks like we probably don't have time to continue this conversation today as we are out of time. However, luckily we have 2 more sessions with you where we can continue to dialogue. I also put a link to our event that'll be next Thursday that'll be looking at expanding the conversation on affordable housing, since this is a topic of great interest. And yeah, there's one other comment that came up around the role of psychotropic drugs to bring some relief to some folks. And that, I think, is a cliffhanger kind of comment to make everyone say, oh, there's so much more we need to continue to unpack as we dive deeper into this issue. So any closing words, Alec, before I stop recording?
Thanks for taking your lunch to join this conversation. I believe that we are, I think we're at a really important time in our history. I think every time is a really important time, but right now there is, I think, a real opportunity to really invest in a narrative of what could be. I think people are really challenging, our current structures and systems. I think everyone is feeling, I shouldn't say everyone, everyone who's not the 1% is feeling the outcomes of our political choices. And there's an opportunity to really talk about and push forward and mobilize different political choices. So I look forward to having that conversation with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Please stay tuned for sessions 2 and 3 with Alec, as well as We are going to be having lots of other wonderful educational sessions, including something specific on housing to think about new and creative strategies to address this. And we hope that everyone joins us. Again, this counts as formal professional development. So feel free to save your Eventbrite registration and submit that as part of your professional development. And have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Alec, thank you once again for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us.